Yeah, okay, so we're up to Ois Hey. In Ois Daled, right, we asked, just to do a very quick recap, we asked, is there this interest on the part of the Frierdikke Rebbe and earlier and the Arizal and in Zohar, there seems to be this interest in describing all the various levels of Klippa and all the way down to the lowest depths of negativity in a lot of detail, when generally we tend to try not to focus on and delve into negativity more than necessary. Obviously, there's some sort of reason here. So the Rebbe said, number one is, one explanation we could give, one way of explaining it would be the fact that Hashem wants to have the negativity in the matter for whatever reason. In order for it to exist, because everything comes from Torah, so because Hashem wants for whatever reason for the negativity to exist, so it has to be described in Torah so that Hashem could bring it into being from within the Torah, in which everything that exists is found first. And once Hashem brings this negativity into being, it's our job to take all of the negativity, all the mata, and convert it into Kedusha, to make it to use the koyach of shtus de Kedusha to make the sheker and the negativity into kesher, into kroshim, the beams for the Mishkan. The problem with this is that it's important that we not engage with too much negativity, with negativity of too great an intensity for us to handle. As we say in brachas every morning, Al Tvienu Lidei Nisayon. And we have this story of Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu Hashem bringing Moshe Rabbeinu to battle with the Klippa of Parai. And as he gets close and Hashem tells him to engage with it, Moshe Rabbeinu says, no, that's way too much for me, that's too powerful for me, I'm scared. And Hashem agrees with Moshe Rabbeinu, says, you're right, it's too much, I'm going to engage it. And Hashem fights that Klippa of Parai, or overpowers that Klippa of Parai directly, because it would have been too much for Moshe Rabbeinu. So if that's the case, then how does it make sense that each of us is supposed to engage the mata to make it into Dir Petachtonim, the lowest of the low, which is this whole idea of the Ein Sof L'mata Mata Ein Tachlis, telling us that Ein Sof goes all the way down to the lowest of the low. Why? So that we can be Mevarer and to convert it to Kedusha. How are we supposed to do that if the lowest of the low, the lowest levels of Klippa are even too much for Moshe Rabbeinu, certainly too much for us? So we're up to Ois Hey now, V'Yuvan, and this will be understood up Hitor Sarav Magid, according to an explanation that the Mizritcha Magid gives. Al Pasuk Laman Shisi Ois Hey Ele B'Kirbay. So Hashem says to Moshe Rabbeinu in this week's parsha, actually, Bayal Parai, Ki Ani Hichbadati Es Libay. Hashem says, come to Parai because I have hardened his heart. Why did Hashem harden Parai's heart? Laman Shisi Oisei Ele B'Kirbay, in order to place these signs of mine among him. Shisi Oisei Ele B'Kirbay, to place these signs of mine among him. Which the pshat of that is that Hashem is saying, I want to bring more makos, and there's a utility in the makos not just to punish Parai and the Mitzrim and to make them change their mind. Because if that was the only point, there's no point in hardening their heart. Just let them go. But there are other utilities, and for the sake of those utilities, Hashem hardened Parai's heart so that there would be an additional 3 makos, which we have in this week's parasha. The Magid gives another layer of interpretation based on more or less the same translation of the words. So the Magid says that Lefisha Kodesh Baruch Hu Hayaretz Levar Kolan and Tzutis Mimitzrayim Min Ashvira. The Shvira refers to Shvira Sakelim. So, without getting into it too deeply, but Shvira Sakelim is the origin of all the nitzutzas, the sparks of Elokus that are embedded within the material, the physical components of the world within a lot of negativity, and then it's our job to uplift them, to extract those sparks of Elokus, those sparks of divinity, and return them to their place through engaging with Torah and mitzvahs, etc. So because Hashem wanted all of those sparks that descended or fell and became embedded within Mitzrayim from the Shviras HaKelim, which is the origin of where all of these nitzutzos, these sparks of divinity, they all originate from that Shvira and end up embedded in the world. Because Hashem wanted all the sparks in Mitzrayim to be extracted and elevated, Hainu kol hadvarim habatelim shel Pari v'shel Mitzrayim, all the dvarim batelim of Pari and Mitzrayim, shehem osios, which are words, chulu. Hashem wanted all of the sparks of Elokus embedded within these words, mundane words of Pari and Mitzrayim. Hashem wanted them to be elevated. Bazeh yihi habirur. So how is this birur, this extraction and elevation of these sparks from these dvarim batelim of Pari and the Mitzrayim, how's that going to be enacted? That's going to be through the fact shehichnis hadiburim ba'osios eila b'Torah. By putting additional words into Torah, and we're going to clarify what all of this means. So by adding in additional words into the Torah, these words being in Torah, obviously the words in Torah are words of Kedusha. By adding in 3 more plagues, which are described in Torah, so Hashem says, Hashem hardened Paro's heart. Because of Paro's heart being hardened, that would require an additional 3 plagues. Because there are now going to be 3 more plagues, there is going to be a description of those 3 plagues in the Torah. So there are now going to be additional words of Torah describing this process in Mitzrayim, which would not have been there had Paro let the Yidden go after the 7 plagues of last week's parsha. So if at this week Paro would let the Yidden go, that would be the end of the story. But the birur wasn't complete. There are still some sparks left within the Dvarim Batelim, these words of Pari and the Mitzrayim, that need to be extracted and elevated. The koyach to extract and elevate those sparks comes from the equivalent or matching words within Torah. So because the birur of the sparks, the extraction and elevation of the sparks in Mitzrayim is not complete, there needs to be additional extraction and elevation of sparks in Mitzrayim. So therefore there need to be additional words added into Torah on this topic that are going to give the koyach to elevate those sparks that remain in Mitzrayim. And so by adding in additional words that describe Mitzrayim and further makas in Mitzrayim, those words in Torah are the source of the koyach, the energy, the force necessary to be able to elevate the remaining sparks. V'zehu, and this is what it means, Laman shisi oisosai eila. Hashem says, I have hardened Paro's heart in order to place these oisos of mine, these signs of mine, literally these makos, right? The makos were signs, they represented Hashem's divinity and power. So that's the pshat. Hashem hardened Paro's heart in order to justify, to give the opportunity for Hashem to give these additional signs, i.e. makos. So Ratzono Lomar, so the Maggid here is reinterpreting the words oisosai to be osios. Osiosai, my osios, my words. Osios shel hashvira. These additional words, dvarim batelim, that contain sparks of Kedusha and Elokus that fell from the Shvira, that became embedded in Mitzrayim. Because these additional sparks in these osios still need to be elevated, Tzorech ani lavaram al yedei Torah. Hashem says, I want these additional sparks to be elevated. How is that going to happen? Through the koyach of Torah. Lachen, therefore, hu min ha'hechrech, it's necessary lishloach aleim od gimel makos, to send an additional 3 makos, bichdei lahachnisam ba'osios tzirufim shebatorah, in order that there should be an additional description of these 3 makos in the words of Torah. The words of Torah carrying the koyach that bring the koyach to be able to elevate and extract those remaining sparks. And because Hashem wanted to elevate those remaining sparks in those words, oisos, in the words, Hashem gave 3 more plagues to add more words in Torah to give the koyach to elevate more sparks.
Why are the 3 makos separate from the rest of the makos? And why is it saying? Isn't this the job of all the makos?
It is. But here what Hashem says is Ki ani hichpadeti es libo, right? So the implication of Hashem saying, come to Paro, why? Because I've hardened his heart. The implication of that is that had Hashem not hardened Paro's heart at this point, he may have just let the Yidden go and said, enough, like 7 plagues, I'm done, go.
Oh, so this is the reason Hashem hardened him.
Exactly. So, because if you think about it, Hashem says, come to Paro. Why do we need to go to Paro? 7 plagues. He doesn't want to let us go yet. Hashem says, no, I hardened his heart. So why would you harden his heart? And then we have to go to him. Just don't harden his heart. So Hashem said, no, I did harden his heart. Why? Leman shisi oisesai ele b'kirbo. So the pshat is Hashem saying there's an additional utility, the utility and the message, the benefit of having these makos, which is to spread awareness of Hashem. This is more the pshat level. Because that hasn't yet been sufficiently completed, I want 3 more makos to spread that awareness further, so I hardened Paro's heart so we can have 3 more makos. Here the Maggid is saying, Hashem says, I hardened Paro's heart. Why? Because there are still remaining sparks in the Dvarim Batalim. And I want those sparks out of those Dvarim Batalim. Leman shisi oisosai oisiosai, in order to elevate and extract the sparks in these remaining words, I need to add more words on this topic in Torah. Those words of Torah on this topic of Mitzrayim, describing these additional makos, will give the koyach to be able to extract those sparks. So that's why Hashem hardened Paro's heart, so there would be more makos. More makos means more words in Torah. More words in Torah, more koyach to extract and elevate the remaining sparks in Mitzrayim. If Hashem would not have hardened Paro's heart and therefore had the grounds to bring 3 more makos, there would have been a substantial percentage of the description of this story in Torah as we have it would have been missing. 30% of the makos would have been missing from Torah. And then there would have been some sparks that it would not have been able to be elevated and extracted. So now we're going to take this explanation, this idea of that the Mizritcha Maggid explains, and elaborate. Even these words, these sparks that fell below and became embedded in negativity in Klippa, those sparks originating from the Shvira, from Shviras HaKelim. We're talking about words that fell, that became embedded in the Dvarim Batalim of Paroi and Eretz Mitzrayim, Ervas HaAretz. Mitzrayim was the worst place in the world at that time, behaviorally. Those words, those Dvarim Batalim, these sparks, all of that negativity, Hem be'emes oisosai. As much as it's true that they are negative and negativity and Klippa and all of those things, they still belong to Hashem. Osios sheli. That's why Hashem says, Laman shisi oisosai. Hashem says, because I still have words of mine that are embedded that need to be extracted, or that have sparks embedded within them that need to be extracted. As we know, the lower down something becomes embedded, the higher the source from which it came. The higher the source something comes from, the lower it ends up being embedded. And there are a number of different ways to illustrate it, and mashalim, etc. If you are dropping things, let's say, into water, doesn't really work, but into, let's say, some sort of mud or foam or something like that, something that has some sort of resistance, if you drop 2 objects of equal weight and you drop one of them from double as high, it's going to penetrate more deeply into the stuff that it's falling into. Why? Because it started higher up, it gains more momentum on the way down, which allows it to penetrate more deeply. Now, in the nimshal, when we talk about sparks becoming embedded, it's not so much because of the momentum that results from falling further. Obviously, that's an oversimplification in terms of the mashal. But the idea is the same, that the higher something's source, the higher the source of any given spark of Elokus, any given spark of Kedusha, this nitzutz, the higher its source, the more koyach it has, and the more koyach it has, the greater the depth to which it can penetrate and become embedded. So the fact that something is embedded in negativity doesn't mean it's not Kedusha, it's not Elokus, doesn't mean it's not of Hashem's character, let's say, of positivity. And on the contrary, the deeper it fell, the higher it came from originally. And the higher the spark is in its truest form, in its original form. Which is why it says, L'man shisi oisoi sai, even the negativity and that which is embedded in the negativity is still of Hashem. Deep down, they are of Hashem, they are Kedusha, they are godly and divine. They have become embedded within negativity, and that's exactly our job. Our job is to extract them from the negativity into which they are embedded and bring them back, revert them to their original form, which is Osios HaKedusha, words of Kedusha, of holiness. They always belong to Hashem. It's just that they are embedded, enclosed in negativity, and we need to return them to their original form. And therefore, so because these words of negativity, these dvarim b'telim of pari, etc., needed to be elevated and to have the sparks within them extracted and returned to their original form, from where does the koyach come to be able to do that? From the equivalent or relevant words in Torah. By these additional events being written in Torah, there are words in Torah that describe these additional 3 plagues. Those words of Torah, Heim noisnim koyach, they give us the koyach, sheyuchel levaras ha'osios lachreish noflu b'shvira. The words in Torah give us the koyach to extract the equivalent or the relevant sparks that are embedded in negativity, right? Because Torah is, ultimately, Torah is seichel, is wisdom. Torah is a collection of facts or pieces of information or ideas. But the difference between the ideas, the facts, the information of Torah and any other information is that this is Anochi, Anonafshik Sovis Yohavis. So every word of Torah that we learn contains Elokus within it. And so the words of Torah contain within them the Elokus, the godliness, the divinity, that will give us the koyach, the energy, the power, the force that we need to be able to extract the relevant sparks from within negativity and elevate them and return them to their original form. And again, in order for us to extract the remaining sparks, there needed to be words of Torah that describe them, those words of Torah containing the Elokus, the divinity that will give us the koyach to get the job done.
So according to this, the last 3 malchus only happened so that this could be revealed?
So that those sparks could be elevated, yes. And had all of the sparks already been elevated sufficiently, or had, let's a bit more precisely, had the words of Torah up until the end of Parshas Va'era, the description of the first 7 plagues, given us sufficient koyach to extract all the sparks, as far as this interpretation of these psukim is concerned, yes, Hashem could have allowed Paroi to let us go, and that's it. But because that wasn't the case, and there were still additional sparks that we did not yet get the koyach to be able to extract and elevate, so now Hashem had to prolong the story within Torah, add more words of Torah on the topic, which will give us more koyach to get this job done, so that we can extract and elevate sufficiently.
The power inside of us.
Well, here it's talking about to
Power
elevate,
himself.
yes, to elevate the sparks of Kedusha in the word Dvarim B'Telim of Pari and the Mitzrayim.
Did the actual maamar itself refine the sparks, like elevate into?
Most likely there was some degree of that associated with the makos, but that's not the message here. The point that is being made here is primarily that the words in Torah that describe the makos, those words in Torah on the topic of Mitzrayim, gave us the yidden in Mitzrayim the koyach to be mavar those nitzutzos that remained within Mitzrayim. So it wasn't so much about the makos themselves, it was more about the makos almost being an excuse or the material to add more words into Torah to give us more koyach to do the birur.
Makkah seems like a clear example of subduing the evil, or however you would say. And what else is refining the tzitzit other than that?
Well, the refining of the netzutzos primarily is through our avodah. So through the Yidden doing whatever they had to do in Mitzrayim. Now, apparently, they didn't yet have sufficient koyach to do that just from the words of Torah describing the first 7 makos. So there needed to be more words of Torah on the topic of Mitzrayim to give that additional remaining koyach that was necessary to finish off the job. Now, it's like you're saying, it's for sure the case, obviously, that the makos themselves are addressing the klippa, but this is talking about something a little bit different.
Does the words of Torah itself elevate the nitzutzim, or gives the Jews the power to do it?
It depends what you mean by the words of Torah. By us learning and saying words of Torah, that would be one of the most effective ways to elevate sparks. And then basically the elevating of sparks is through 2 primary things generally, which is Torah and mitzvahs. But even if we are elevating sparks by saying words of Torah, that's still us saying the words. But for us to elevate sparks in the world through saying the words of Torah need to exist. Now, not only do the words of Torah need to exist in order for us to be able to say them, but the words in the Torah need to exist to give us the koyach to get the job done, whether it's through learning Torah or doing mitzvahs. Make sense?
Is there any other idea where this was ever spoken about? I never heard of that.
It's a very, I wouldn't say there's nowhere else, but this idea is from the Maggid,
Yeah.
but it's not something that you see around a lot.
We don't learn the Maggid's Chassidus. What's the Maggid's Chassidus?
Generally, not all that much. So this is from Ur Torah.
Rebbe got from
Right, I mean, yes. Now, the Alter Rebbe obviously has his own very original, unique style of teaching Chassidus, but ultimately the material that is teaching came from the Maggid. But the Alter Rebbe's approach of teaching it is very different to the Maggid's, which is why there was the Gzeira against the Chassidus in the time of the Alter Rebbe happened, even though that Gzeira had already happened in the time of the Baal Shem Tov, and that already told the mashal of the prince and the king in the time of the Baal Shem Tov, that to do the whole thing again in the time of the Alter Rebbe, because the Alter Rebbe's approach to teaching Chassidus was different and was achieving a whole new objective that the Chassidus of the Baal Shem Tov and the Maggid wasn't achieving. Yeah, okay. V'hine av she'alashon b'Torah harav Maggid hu bir hadvarim b'telim shel Paroi v'shel Mitzrayim. We'll go through, I was just debating about skipping this because it's not absolutely necessary and we've got a lot to get through, but let's go through it very, very quickly. The Maggid says the Dvarim B'Telim, which seems like the least of Paro's evils, let's say, and those are the Mitzrayim. which seems to indicate that this is talking about birur of the sparks in the Dvarim Batelim, which are the least of, their evils, rather than a birur of the things that are worse than that. Even though the words of the Mizricha Magid imply that this is a birur of Dvarim Batelim as opposed to all the rest of the way worse stuff that Pari and the Mitzrayim were involved in, the Rebbe says it obviously refers to all of those things also, because if you look at the pshat of the pasuk, it's talking about plagues that Hashem brought to address the full klippa of Mitzrayim, the negativity, the full extent of the negativity of Pari and the Mitzrayim. So obviously it's not just the Dvarim Batelim, it's also everything worse than that. Thank you very much. When it says B'shalach Pari Esa'am, right? B'shalach Pari Esa'am means next week's parasha starts talking about when Pari sent the Yidden out of Mitzrayim. B'shalach Pari Es Ha'am, Es can mean with. And it says that Pari actually sent, as Moshe told him he would, not only are you going to let us go, you're going to actually send us supplies and the things that we need. We see, ultimately, the idea being that we see that not only did Pari let them leave, he actually provided supplies of his own. Pari actually participated in the birur himself. So we see that the birur wasn't just in the Dvarim Batelim, these minimally negative, let's say, aspects of Pari and the Mitzrayim, but it was all the way down. The birur affected all the way to Pari and the Mitzrayim Kepshotam, to the point that Pari himself had been nisparer, to the extent that he himself actually participated and contributed supplies that the Yidden needed to serve Hashem in the desert. Ultimately, point of all of this being that through this birur, all the sparks that remained within Mitzrayim, in all the negativity within Mitzrayim and Pari and the Mitzrayim, all of it ended up being nisbarer, being extracted, separated and elevated, and that was able to be completed as a result of the koyach eliki, this divine koyach, this divine power, energy, whatever we want to call it, that was contained in these additional words describing these additional 3 plagues. That was the point of the extra 3 plagues, to add more words in Torah, to give us additional koyach to get the job done. So we see here that the words of Torah actually are the koyach to get the job done. That's where the koyach to get the job done comes from. Based on all of this, we can now explain further. And yes, it's true. We ask Hashem, don't subject us to challenges, to circumstances or events or environments, etc., that will challenge our strength in keeping Torah mitzvahs the way that we should, implying that we should not be engaging with the full extent of klippa, because if we should be, then we wouldn't be asking Hashem, Al Tavienu L'Dei Nisayon. We should say, yeah, Tavienu L'Dei Nisayon, let's go get him. Apparently not. Mikol Makam, nevertheless, so how is it now we're going to see how it's possible that both things can be true at the same time, that we do not want to engage with the depths of negativity. Mikol Makam, nevertheless, at the same time, that doesn't mean that it's not part of our responsibility to elevate even the lowest of the low. So how does that work? How can we elevate the lowest of the low if we are supposed to try and avoid engaging with it and being involved with it? Because the koyach for that birur comes from the relevant words in Torah, by learning those words in Torah, that can actually be a method of addressing those klippas and being mevarer whatever needs to be nisbar of extracting and elevating the sparks within those klippas. When it comes to Avodah Zarah, we have a similar issue. When it comes to Avodah Zarah, it's asur al pi halacha, it's isur deraisa to study Avodah Zarah, to learn texts that describe Avodah Zarah. Obviously, we're talking about texts written from the view of the Avodah Zarah and its interests, etc. Because obviously studying books, texts written from the interest of the Avodah Zarah, secular texts that describe Avodah Zarah, that comes with a risk. And that's an Isur Deraisa.
So it's talking, when it says Mata Mata Yisr, it's talking about the Shalosh Klipas of Mass.
Correct.
So which can't be elevated, we say.
Well, there is elevating to be done. But how?
Refraining from it.
Well, that's one part of it, but there's more. So it depends. We could, because we could say there are the sparks in that. There are sparks that it is technically impossible to elevate. Those sparks being, let's say, the sparks of Elokus in non-kosher food, for example, right? The way to elevate those sparks is to resist the temptation to eat that food. There are sparks, and the way that the Rebbe is saying, we say, Al Tavienu L'Dei Nisayon, right? Or the story of Moshe Rabbeinu that we read last week from Zohar, in which Hashem tells Moshe to go engage with the klippa, and Moshe says, I don't want to, I'm too scared, it's too much for me. It seems that obviously Hashem wasn't telling Moshe Rabbeinu to do something that was asur pi halacha, to do something that was not allowed according to Torah, which means there are situations in which it might be technically halachically permitted, at least arguably, but it would be a bad idea because we'd be exposing or subjecting ourselves to negativity, which might be like the example, that we had mentioned of maybe a person wanting to go and do mivtzoyim or shlichas in an environment that is completely non-kosher and an environment in which no Torah observant Jew, certainly no chassid or shliach, should be subjecting themselves or putting themselves in. The question is it halachically permissible to put oneself in those circumstances? There might be some gray areas. The question then becomes, let's say, for example, let's go back to this example. Let's say that there is a Yid, right? There are Jews who are hanging out in circumstances or in an environment in which and again, there may be gray, and it may be that there are some circumstances which might be, maybe arguable or doable for one shliach and not for another, depending on, their personality and experiences, etc. But let's say that there is, there's a Jew hanging out somewhere who, could really use some connection to Torah mitzvahs, but they're in a situation in which the shliach really should not be putting themselves. Right? They're hanging out in an environment in which the shliach really shouldn't be going. So what are you supposed to do? Are you supposed to be makar of that yid? Yes, obviously we want that yid. And then the Yid is a bit of a clearer version of that, just because it's obvious if there's a Jew, we want to bring them closer to Torah mitzvahs if they're, not visibly connected to Torah mitzvahs, let's say. The same way that there's a Yid there who could use our help in becoming more strongly connected to Torah and mitzvahs visibly, there are also sparks there that could ideally be elevated. So what are we supposed to do? If there's a situation in which we should not be putting ourselves, there is still a means by which we can cause a birur to be able to happen, and that is by learning the relevant Torah. Because the koyach that our ability to be mavarer, had we been able to go there, right? Let's say every day when we go around, we go out into the world and we engage with the world in regular normal life, regular normal circumstances, and hopefully we're engaging with the world, with the intent to be mavarer as much as possible, etc. Where do we get the koyach to do that? The koyach that we have to do that comes from Torah. Right? Every Yid and every Shliach and everyone has to be plugged into Torah in order to have the koyach to do that job. So if the koyach to do that job is coming from Torah anyways, really ultimately it's the koyach in the Torah that is getting the job done, and we are the facilitator, the conduit or the channel for the koyach in the Torah to, sort of channel it into that circumstance to get the job done. If there's a circumstance in which we are not supposed to go or are not able to go, it's the same koyach HaTorah that's going to get that job done as any other job. So if we can't go there, let's actually learn the relevant words in Torah. And when we learn those words, we are expressing those words verbally. We're creating physical sound waves in the world of those words of Torah, which gives that koyach in those words of Torah a foothold in Gashmias, which will, get them started, let's say, on the road to getting the job done.
Words would be like the halacha that you can't go to a certain place. Like, how do you?
Yes, exactly, and that's exactly what we're in the middle of saying. So the Rebbe is pointing out here that yes, it's halachically prohibited to study avodah zarah. Avodah zarah is part of the world, and there are nitzutzos, there's kedusha, there are sparks in avodah zarah that need to be elevated. That's in that information and those ideas that need to be elevated. So how do we elevate it if we're not allowed to study? We could study those books with the intent to. No, you're not allowed to. It doesn't work that way. Okay, so how are we supposed to get at those sparks if we can't interact with it?
So let's say the shliach, let's say, wants to do an event, right? And they know the only way they'll be able to get people is if they don't have mechitza, let's say. That's against Torah. So what do? They ask for, they look into Torah, they learn the halacha. They were just mevar the instance of not having mechitza, basically.
If it's a kind of event that would require it, yes, exactly.
Probably, yeah, it's the halacha rule that way.
Yes, exactly.
So, but that's the same idea of refraining from shalosh klipas minister. You're elevating it. So is mata is referring to shalosh klipas minister. So it's basically describing here how you elevate even that.
It might not necessarily need to be only within Shalosh Klipas HaTameis. It could be within things that are too closely associated with Shalosh Klipas HaTameis for us to be able to go and get them.
Like what?
Also, isn't it Aser is Shalosh Klipas?
Yeah.
Yes. Correct.
Like the idea of what you're saying about a shliach, someone say bring me sefer Torah into like a bar or a club on like Purim or whatever he was doing. Like it's very simple. That's a halachic issue. He asks the Rav. Either it's shalosh klipas advanced or it's mutter. There's no gray area in Torah. Meaning a Rav costs one way or the other. No.
Yes. That being said, there is such thing as a situation that is gray in that it might be mutter for some people and not for others. For example, and maybe mutter and osir are words that are a little stronger, but it could be that two people would ask the Rav the same question. For one of them, the Rav would say yes, and for one, the Rav would say no. For example, right, let's say, I can tell you, I was on Merkar Shlichus in like very, very rural places. I mean, I went 5 times, I think, traveled to North and South Dakota when there were not permanent shluchim in either of those 2 states. When I went there, those were the only 2 remaining states that didn't have a Chabad house. and we were visiting like a small town by North and South Dakota standards. So small. And there was a Yid there who we had a record of, who owned a restaurant that was obviously non-kosher. And as a rule, a Frumi is not allowed to walk into a non-kosher restaurant, because if someone sees you in there, Marasain, and they'll be like, oh, I saw that Chabad rabbi was in that restaurant. Obviously it's kosher, we can go and eat. So as a rule, you're not allowed to walk into a non-kosher eatery. The thing is, there's like a Yid there who has no shaykhs to mitzvahs. You want to go talk to him, try to, share divrei Torah, some inspiration, connect him, put on tefillin, something. It's like, and the notes say very clearly he doesn't like to be engaged at home. You have to see him at work. So we called the Rav. The Rav asked us a bunch of questions. And ultimately what he said was, you're in the middle of nowhere. There is no one who cares about kosher who might see you walk in there and is going to think, oh, the Chabad rabbi went there, so I'm allowed to eat that food. There are 0 people who keep kosher in this whole state, aside from us. So there's no risk of any negative outcome, so we were allowed to go in. Now, let's say I called the same Rav and said, or had someone else been on Merkah Shlichus, in the same circumstance, I called the Rav and said all of these things and also said, you know what, like, I'm a Baal Tshuva and, I really like food, and the restaurant that he owns actually used to be like one of my favorite restaurants, and I've been avoiding them for years because I like it too much, and I don't think it's a good idea for me to walk past it, and I'll walk around the block if I know there's one coming up. Not necessarily would the Rav say, yes, you should go in there to find that Yid, because if it's going to put this person at risk because it's a restaurant that he knows and he has experience with and he likes very much, and it's a real struggle for him to resist that food, right? So the going into the restaurant per se might be great depending on the person. So maybe for me it's fine, but for someone else who struggles with that particular thing, it's not fine.
Okay.
Right, so just the point here, the thing that this is clarifying is, see, there's the klippa that's embedded in Shalosh Klippas HaTameis. Now that klippa, there is no even potential kosher way to be mavaret by engaging. The only way to be mavaret is by avoiding, by resisting engagement. Right? Non-kosher food, for example. Which is the obvious case, or Avodah Zarah. You're not allowed to learn those books. You're not allowed to learn about Avodah Zarah. So how can you be mavar the netzutzas in Avodah Zarah? By learning the halachos, learn the words of Torah. You're allowed to learn the halachos of Avodah Zarah in Rambam. You're allowed to learn the Gemara. You're allowed to learn the halachos of Avodah Zarah. So when you learn the halachos of Avodah Zarah, from where does the koyach to be mavar any netzutzas come from? From Torah. So learn those halachos. That's where the koyach to be mavar comes from. You learn the halachos. You are containing that information in your physical brain cells. You're saying the words. You're creating physical vibrations. You're giving the koyach in those words a foothold in Gashmias, which will allow the nitzutzos in that Avodah Zarah to be nismar.
Well,
So, yeah.
if we're going on the same thought process of what the whole question is based on, it like goes through explicitly the levels and the levels down there. When you learn Allah, they're not allowed to do something that's not explicit at all until like how explicit the actual abir would be. So let's say you're not allowed to serve Avodah Zarah. I never learned the halacha, so it doesn't go into all the
They get
things.
pretty detailed.
Yeah.
Rambam, yeah, there's like prakim and prakim and
If
prakim.
somebody would go and learn serve Avodah Zarah, they're using their whole emotional like.
That's true.
So it's like it's not on the same level. Or if like let's say you're not allowed to Gilai Rhymes, right? You're not allowed to put yourself in that place. If you learn halachas about it, it's not like one's like you're learning what you're not allowed to do, one you're actually putting your emotions in.
Right, but there are some. So any birur that we do, the koyach to do the birur comes from Torah. So let's look at it this way, right? The koyach to do the birur comes from Torah. There are some birurim where we are supposed to channel the koyach of Torah by learning Torah, being connected to Torah, and then engaging those parts of the world. Let's say kosher food, right? The netzutzas in kosher food, in healthy kosher food, we should be mavar those netzutzos by eating the right food in the right amounts for the right reasons, and then using that energy to serve Hashem. The koyach to do that birur comes from being connected to Torah. So the koyach to do it comes from Torah either way. So when it comes to kosher food, the way that we channel the koyach of Torah to be mavar the food is by engaging with the food and eating it. When it comes to non-kosher food, the way that we channel the koyach in the Torah to be mavar the nitzutzos in that food is by learning about it. By learning those halachos and those words in Torah, whether it's the halachas, the pnimius of Torah, etc., we are now taking those words of Torah, learning them, bringing them into the world, and that's the correct way of channeling the koyach for that kind of birur. Right, so now, and this is sort of the in-between where it gets confusing. And obviously, the Rebbe is talking about this because the Rebbe keeps saying, we say in davening, Al Tavyeinu Lidei Nisayon, right? Al Tavyeinu Lidei Nisayon doesn't mean, don't make me do something wrong. That's not what Al Tavyeinu Lidei Nisayon means. Al Tavyeinu Lidei Nisayon means, don't put me in a circumstance that will make it hard for me not to do something wrong, right? That's what a Nisayon is. It's a test, a challenge. Which means that it's ideal for us to not be in circumstances that are challenging. Even if it's not halachically prohibited to be in that environment, if the environment poses a challenge to us, puts us at risk, it's better not to go there. The problem is, if there are nitzutzos there, how do we be mavar those nitzutzos if it's better not to go there? So there are sparks there. We are supposed to elevate those sparks, but we're not allowed to go. It's better not to go there. So what do we do?
Who said you have to walk into the restaurant? Why can't you wait for him to come out first? I don't get the whole between things.
So that's with the yid. Let's say you're not talking about the yid, you're talking about nitzutzos. Let's say, for example, right?
When it says
Is
nisayon,
this the
when it
Rebbe's
says nisayon, isn't it
answer,
just
or
talking
there's
about
more?
like is it talking about that in between, or is it talking about don't bring us to, meaning there is a, like, it's just meaning, yeah, we do stay away from certain things. Like, don't put me in a test where I'm gonna want to do something that I'm not allowed to do because.
Right, but the
what was
key
the
is.
question? The question is that you should have the nisayon because then you're able to mavar it.
No, see, what you said was, don't put us in a situation in which we'll want to do something bad, right?
Okay.
Which means that being in a situation in which we'll want to do something bad, we haven't done something bad yet, and we might not, but we'll be at risk, best not to be in that situation. Right?
I see. And the question is,
What if there are sparks in that environment?
Right. Oh, I see. It's like that's the gray. That's like the borderline. Where it's
Bingo.
Like, okay, because before every avera, there's like a. There's like a border that is in that gray in between, right?
Like, let's say, for example, that, and that's why I had to pick a very specific example. I couldn't just say non-kosher restaurant because you're not allowed to go in there. Because in that example, I called a Rav and he said that we could. Or let's say, for example, let's say there's a Jew who didn't put on tefillin today and is standing out front of a non-kosher fast food place. Can I go put tefillin on him there? Absolutely, no problem. Someone else who just started keeping kosher and really struggles and happens to have a history of really enjoying food from this particular fast food place, no, don't go put tefillin on that guy. Run away and send someone else a text to go do it. Right? So let's say that,
But we ask Hashem not to bring us to that.
right. So for me, that wouldn't be a nisayon. But for that person, it would be. Now, let's say there's no one else around. Let's say that this person who just started keeping kosher last week and is still really struggling, is the only Shomer Torah Mitzvah Yid in the whole neighborhood. And there's a Yid out front of that restaurant who hasn't put on tefillin. And you're not going to have a chance to get at them later. Should they go do that if there's like a real risk that they might end up, Rahman al-Islam eating treif as a result? No, they shouldn't. That's nisayon. It's not osur al pi halacha to stand in front of that place, but for them, that would be a nisayon that they should be avoiding. So what could they do? They can go sit down somewhere and learn about Mivtzoim. Or...
Right. We're asking Hashem basically, don't let us pass by a non-kosher restaurant where there's a Jew inside. That's the nisayon. not
for the person
We
who...
ask Hashem not why-
Well, it wouldn't be don't make me walk past when there's someone inside. It would be don't make me end up in a non-kosher restaurant that I really like and I'm going to struggle not to eat from, or right out the front of it when they have fans blowing the smell of the food out into the street. Don't land me in front of that store.
Okay, fine. Oh, and you're saying that question is why not, just in case there's something. You're saying
The question becomes, but what about the nitzutzos that are there?
right.
So in the case of a yid who needs to put on tefillin, that's sort of almost a mashal for the nitzutzos, or an equivalent that's just a bit more obvious and
Is
tangible.
this the final answer that the Rebbe comes with?
Yeah, I would say it's the final answer, but obviously the Rebbe is going to elaborate and take it further and
So
go
the whole-
deeper.
So as of now, the reason why it goes mata mata and it explicitly explains it, because we are supposed to go there, but the way we go there is through learning.
We are supposed to be mavara, correct. The way that we be mavara things that are too matter for us to engage,
So the halacha is-
to learn the Torah, whether it's halachas, pnimius Torah, etc.
But
and
it's
that,
technically
just finishing the idea that the way that it's proven is from what the Maggid says about how these words of Torah were added, these three makkais were added specifically to elevate parais in the world so we could learn the Torah.
Yes, I wouldn't say prove it, but that's sort of the basis. That's the text that forms the basis for it. Yes, exactly.
if we could technically be memorizing exercise by just learning Torah, then why do you have to go out and actually like do shofas and all that? Like, why can't you just sit at home learning all Torah?
But that's a yid.
So,
Because there's other Jews that aren't learning
okay,
Torah. And everyone.
well, let's look at it as the koyach to be mavarer, everything comes from Torah. And the ideal way to channel the koyach of Torah, or the ideal way to be mavarer nitzutzos, as a general rule, the ideal approach is to engage with the part of the world that those sparks are embedded in. In a situation in which that's not an option, the option that we use then in those situations is by learning the Torah.
The
So-
ideal is to actually be able to engage with it.
Sorry?
The ideal is to be able to engage with it.
Yes, when that's an option. Correct. Right, so we said even though it's asur to learn the halachas, to learn study avodah zarah, we are obligated to learn all of Torah. Kol gam hilchas avodah zarah. We are supposed to learn hilchas avodah zarah in Torah. Shebehem nisbaro kama pratim bofen avodasa. The basics or the process of serving avodah zarah is described in these halachas. Va'inyan bazeh prata inyanim d'avodah zarah sheksuv b'Torah nasim inyan shel Torah. When the specifics of how avodah zarah is served are described in Torah, that description in halacha, that description in Torah is now part of Torah. שגם עשו אמר בפרשה הוא חלק מתורה, ולכן כאשר לא עמדי בתורה הלכות עבודה זרה, הנה על ידי זה גוף המבטלים את העבודה זרה. We can't be mavara avodah zarah by engaging with it or by even studying it. What we can do is learn the Torah about it, and because that's Torah, that is a source of koyach to affect that birur, and when we learn it, that's exactly what we do. ובפרט כאשר לא נמאס ההלכה שצריך להיות שקץ תשקצנו ועבי תעבדון, אזי פועלים במציאס העבודה זרה שנעשה ביטול ועיבוד עבודה זרה בתכלס. Through learning about the fact that the Torah tells us, and there is a chiyuv to be mevatel avodah zarah, to neutralize avodah zarah, when we learn in Torah the fact that one has to be mevatel avodah zarah, by learning that in Torah, that causes a bittul of avodah zarah. So same thing here. We do have the responsibility and the job to be mevarer all the nitzutzos, even in mato. When it comes to mato, that is so negative that we shouldn't be engaging with it, even not necessarily because it's osur, but because it's a nisayon. It puts us at risk, so we shouldn't be engaging with it. The way that we are mevarer that is by learning the Torah about it, which is then going to explain why there is an interest in Torah Shabbal Peh in explaining and describing in detail the mata all the way down to the mata arein tachlis of Klippa. It is important to describe that because now that description exists in Torah, gives us the opportunity to learn it in Torah, gives us the opportunity to be mevarer it.